Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to do an operations update. I'm doing it a little differently and using a little different map because this one allows me to kind of sweep around the battlefield a little bit and show you exactly what's going on. As I've said in previous videos, there just isn't a ton of stuff going on. And this is largely because we've entered mud season in Ukraine, and mud causes massive slowdowns for militaries across the board. So I'm going to do a video a little bit later on about the effects of fighting a war in wintertime and what challenges both militaries face here. But let's start off with an operations update. So if you remember, I'll start down here because this is the biggest portion, which is Kirstan. If you remember, this region right here was, last time we spoke, the Russians actually had a more territory up here. The Ukrainians have swept in and taken down some of this territory and driven it down. However, the Ukrainians, I should use blue for them, but oh well. However, the Ukrainians are running into resistance. The Russians have heavily fortified the area right next to the river, along the banks of the river, and they are creating this very heavily fortified arc that's right here. And there's something like 7 different units providing coverage in this region. I mean, they have the 11th Separate Assault Brigade, 140th Artillery Regiment there, 34th Motorized Rifle Brigade, 10th Special Purposes Brigade. So that's just a few of them. And incidentally, the Russians also have a headquarters nearby, the 5th Combined Arms Army, which is sitting somewhere in here. So the reality is with the mud, with the massive Russian fortifications in this region, Ukraine is going to find it difficult to push downward any further, at least until the ground freezes up, or at least until they soften up these units pretty significantly, which they are. The Ukrainians are softening the Russians in that region pretty heavily. Additionally, some of the defenses Russia has around Kherson is another headquarters located here. They have another headquarters located in Kherson, and they have 4 large units conducting defensive operations from the 33rd Guards Motorized Rifle Regiment, the 108th Guards Air Assault Regiment. So they have some significant units conducting defensive operations in this region as well. Interestingly, when we drop down to show the bigger picture with Melita Pool in it, what was originally happening, and the reason people thought that the Russians were abandoning Kherson to the Ukrainians was their reinforcement efforts of the Russians were going to Melita Pool. They were trying to reinforce there. Well, what later was determined to have happened is the fresh conscripts, the fresh kind of green troops that aren't necessarily very battle hardened, or are they very tactically sound, they went to Melita Pool to reinforce, because right now Melita Pool is not in a line of sight for Ukraine in the near term. This freed up military units that were trained, that are battle hardened, that do have the experience to redeploy from Melita Pool over to Kherson and reinforce. So the Russians are not giving up Kherson, as some people have thought. They aren't retreating. They are fortifying, and they are creating a nice wall here, there, and a wall that's roughly in this region here. Now, from the unit map locations on open source intelligence, this whole box right here has very little Russian units in it. So, and this is kind of where you can see the Ukrainians somewhat exploiting that, where they have a downturn here of their forces. Again, I should use blue for Ukraine. I keep forgetting to do that. So Ukraine is kind of pinching in here. And I think ideally, if the ground can freeze, this is a lot of flat ground right here. There's only a river that runs right here roughly. But a lot of this ground will freeze, and they may be able to divide these 2 units here and create a wedge right here, and that would pinch off this large section of Russian troops that would be pinned against the Dnipro River. And these bridges that are in Kherson and Novokakhavka are somewhat unstable. This is where the dam is, so they still have that, but Ukraine has tried to crater the top of the dam so that it's hard to drive vehicles over it without actually destroying the dam itself. Usually there's specific munitions for this, to where the road is unpassable by putting like 2-foot craters in it, but the dam's integrity still maintains. So that's what we're looking at right now in Kherson. And again, not a lot of movement. That's why I haven't done these, and that's because we're in mud season, and Ukraine wanting to conduct these in a combined arms effort where they have mechanized, and then they also have infantry and air cover. When you lose the mechanized aspect of that, or even the light vehicle aspect of it because of the mud, you're kind of in an infantry versus infantry fight, and the advantage Ukraine has is limited there. So they're just biding their time to wait for the ground to start freezing and potentially start conducting more movements there. So that's we're looking at in Kherson. Moving around the battlefield, let's go over to the Donetsk region. So this is where the fighting around Bakhmut is taking place. So there's two places. I don't know if I can zoom in far enough. I can't, baby. There we go. There's two places to keep an eye on here. Obviously Bakhmut, which was up here, and I'll come back up there. And then this location right here, which is Avdiivka, and I probably pronounced that wrong, but this is a large hub here, and it is heavily defended by Ukrainians. And this is actually where a big portion of where Russia is conducting offensive operations is taking place along this line. Let me zoom it back out a little bit so you can see both. So a lot of offensive operations for Russia are still taking place in Bakhmut and down here and all along this line, trying to take apparently New York. That's an interesting name. I never noticed that until now. And then these other towns. So offensive operations, Russia's still on the offensive, and they're trying to take this because it would be a psychological win for them. But the Ukrainians have pushed them back. In fact, the Ukrainians redeployed a mechanized unit to Bakhmut to pretty much smack down private military contractor Wagner Group, who is the biggest operator in this region. Now, also in Bakhmut, they have military units there, but they're not as prevalent. I mean, you have the 6th separate motorized rifle regiment up in there from Russia, but like I said, this is a Wagner Group region, and it's definitely something that Russia is interested in. They're assuming Wagner Group's private military contractors are going to be a little bit more adept at fighting up here. But you notice that there's this nice little bow here, and that's because because Ukraine has massive defenses here. This is a big piece of territory. This is a critical piece of infrastructure in the city there, and Russia keeps throwing units at them, and it's unsuccessful. And a lot of this is the part of the Bakhmut, the 11th Separate Motorized Rifle Brigade, which is one of their more elite units, but is also heavily degraded, keeps throwing themselves against this, and Ukraine continues to repel it. Same with Bakhmut. Ukraine continues to repel. This is an even more critical hub. As you can see, multiple rail and road networks come into here, and this is kind of a key to try to move further along these routes. But again, Ukraine is doing a very good job holding them there. Interestingly, Russia up in the northern part over here, heading towards Kharkiv near Lyman and Severodonetsk, they're actually using a strategy where they're going on the offensive to conduct a defense. They know that their defensive lines here are so weak and broken that it's difficult for them to defend. And incidentally, the way the terrain works is this is all downhill. So the Ukrainians would be fighting a downhill battle, and the Russians would be trying to defend uphill. That's very difficult to do. So Russians are on the offensive here, and they again are being unsuccessful. So that's kind of where we're at. Not a lot of movement. I'm going to talk about winter warfare here in a bit, and kind of why there's not any movement on the battlefield right now because of the mud.